Gender means to bring forward. To engender is to bring forward or to reproduce. And to reproduce is to make a reproduction of a thing. So it's almost like copying a thing. This will make sense because at the level of base, primary, fundamental reality, there's nothing to produce except that reality, really. Not that you'll have a principal multiplicity of that reality, but you'll have a kind of self-contained pluralization of that reality within that base single reality. So the principle of gender is the principle of reality engendering unto itself, kind of. Reality reproducing itself. People think of gender, we think of masculine, feminine, almost like a polarizing interplay between masculine and feminine. Now let's examine this. We'll use a little bit of Pythagorean systematics, i.e. if you've read the Pythagorean Sourcebook, you're probably familiar with the kind of its exposition of number, and not number as the Pythagoreans don't really treat number as a completely utilitarian thing. They treat it as principle. So you have monad, dyad, triad, so on and so forth. Really, those three are going to be important for this discussion. How I relate the principle of gender. That probably brings the Kabbalion to mind for the listener. We'll talk a little bit about the Kabbalions' principle of gender, but this isn't going to be limited to the Kabbalionic principle of gender per se, although I think it is a good exposition thereof. But anyways, Pythagorean systematics, you have the monad, you have the dyad, triad, so on and so forth. Like I said, the important thing to note with these systematics, which I'm going to call them that, different systems, is that each one after monad contains its antecedent number. So to kind of preface that, the way I like to explain the first principle to people is that, or any primary principle, something that's necessary about it, is that it's primary not only as though in a sequence, as in the first of a sequence, but also it's primary amongst every number in that sequence. So 1 is primary in 2. 2 is composed of 1, right? So even amongst 2, 3, 4, 1 is primary therein. Like, it is fundamentally 1, each of those. And 3 is also more 2 than it is 3 in a way. And so on and so forth. If you've read the Pythagorean Sourcebook, depending on what translation, well, actually, I think it's only Kenneth Guthrie Sylvan, I might be wrong, but you may have seen the diagrams therein where the dyad is actually just, well, the monad is depicted as a circle, not necessarily the circle with a dot, which you might be thinking of, but think of it as just a circle, a hollow circle. And the dyad has that hollow circle, but it also has 2 circles inside of it, which means in total it's actually 3 circles, but really you have this kind of dyad within the monad, you can think of it. And the same thing with 3, and so on and so forth. Although after 3 it might start to be depicted differently. Even at 3 it might be depicted differently, but you get the point. So we'll have to discuss base fundamental reality. I know this will get a little bit tangential, but we'll get back to gender. In the, well, actually, we'll do that right now. In the dyad, you have the 2 circles inside the big circle, right? Inside the monad. And then the triad, you have that same scheme, except you have a third. Or sometimes it's a triangle depicted, but you have a third circle in the middle, in a lot of cases. And what that third circle kind of represents is the reproduction of the monad via the dyad. So the way I think of the dyad is this kind of reproductive principle. It's dynamic, reproducing the monad, and you get the reproduction thereof in the triad. The triad being kind of the self-reference of the monad, and the dyad being the monad's operation unto itself. The way Plotinus would probably see this, and he talks about this somewhere, I'll try to put up a quote, but if I don't, you'll have to forgive that. And he doesn't word it exactly how I'm going to word it, but he seems to imply that nous, and I'll also preface that some Platonists distinct the monad from the one, but we're not going to get into that dialectic here because it's a little bit irrelevant. But Plotinus kind of puts nous as this, I don't want to say indefinite dyad, but as this subject-object distinction. He says nous is fundamentally, well, not fundamentally, but in effect, nous is dual because it has the thinker and the object of thought. So it's always dual. Although my response to that is you have to have the thinking subject precede its operation, and I would put that as the primary principle, but we'll put that as the monad, and we won't get into that being the one in this video, but we'll put the monad as the thinking substrate without its operation of thought, so kind of the subject in itself, you could say. Nous as the subject-object dynamo, which, you know, that's two things, so that kind of makes sense putting that as the dyad. Although, you'll note, and we'll get into this in a little bit, that even in that operation, part of that operation is the thing in itself, and then the object of its operation, as well as the operation itself. So, for instance, you could put dyad, you know, 1, 2, there's 2 in the dyad. One of them is actually the thing in itself. The second is the object of its process, and the whole notion of the dyad as the process itself. Of course, it's still a process that the monad is enacting, but here's a good analogy to understand why the monad is preserved, even if it is an operant. Take your mind, for instance. Your mind can take on numerous conditions and states, but it never stops being a mind. Its metastructure is never changed. It could be happy, sad, whatever. You could be conscious of multiple different things. Consciousness in itself is unaffected. It's still consciousness, if that makes sense. The metastructure is still there. And if it's not, you haven't reached a metastructure. Metastructure is a good word. Chris Langan is the first. I think he's the only one who uses that, but it's a good word. The structure that contains other structures, in a sense. So, the first principle can still, indeed, go into things that are kind of dualizing and pluralizing, like subject-object distinction, and even that distinction creating conditions, creating a plurality of souls without the actual monad, without a secession or a diffusion of that monad into its processes, right? If that makes sense. So you have the monad preserved even though you have the dyad and the triad. So hopefully this is all, if I get tangential, it's probably for a decent reason. Just try to follow along. I'll try to tie points back together. So we have this engendering process that does not actually diminish the thing itself, base fundamental reality, but fundamental reality is participating in that in a way that does not... anyways, you have the monad engaging in this process that is not single per se, but the singularity or the unity of the monad is never lost to its process. It's not contradictory. It's always fundamental. Even the process is ultimately sublimated into a unitary principle, okay? If that makes sense. So, now to masculine, feminine. Of course, when you think of gender, actually, hold on, triad, right? So you create the triad is also there, and that kind of gets into pluralization, because what does this subject-object distinction do? I apologize for getting a little wishy-washy, but what does that do? Well, it creates conditions, creates definition. Creation of definition is what creates this kind of pluralization of minds, or souls rather, as a kind of, Chris Lane would put as a distributed manifold, which I think is fairly accurate. But you have this monad participating in its own definition, and it's not limited to one instance of participation, but it's never fundamentally plural. It's fundamentally unitary, but it's just simply not limited to one instance of definition, of its own definition. So, that is the triad. The triad is its reproduction. And the triad, in this case, we would put that as all, like, just definition generally, or conditioned souls as kind of made in the image of the fundamental principle. This would be like the Son. You could say the Holy Spirit is kind of like the dyad, maybe, depending on your interpretation. I don't think a lot of Christian interpretations would put it like that, but I would almost say that a triad between, well, not to confuse with the use of triad I'm using earlier, but like a triune, like Father, Mother, and Son would be very good. But yes, the Son is in the image of the Father. That's the triad. As far as I understand it, I think this is a very useful perspective at the very least. Anyways, that's the reproduction. That's the Son. That's the image. It's not the image in the sense that it's like a material image, but it is conditioned in the image of the fundamental principle via its own self-involvement. So this is gender is ultimately an involutionary thing, i.e. a self-involving thing. It's the first principle's self-involvement that reproduces itself. There's nothing else to reproduce, so the self-involvement must. That's why this must be the way it is. Like, this must be the way reality works. This must be the way plurality is reconciled in unity, because there's nothing else that could happen, right? If you have an absolute fundamental reality principle and there's nothing beyond it, the true, like, meditating on the meaning of absolute is very useful for this. But anyways, back to masculine, feminine, which I was going to touch on, but I wanted to talk about the triad a little bit more. Masculine, feminine. God, there's a lot of people, like, on the side of the road here. Anyways, masculine, feminine is what people think of when they think of gender as a kind of polarity. And I might get into polarity, Kabbalionic polarity, might not, but people generally refer to God as masculine. He with a capital H, him. I do this as well. But it's a fair question to ask, is God gendered? Is God, like, supra-gendered? Is God masculine? Is God feminine? Because, you know, you could argue potentially that being the womb of creation, giving birth to creation, is feminine. This will all make sense. But I'm going to argue that God is indeed masculine, and that there's a good reason he's referred to as masculine, and will clarify a lot of things to avoid upsetting the ladies. But because there is clarification needed, because of course sex isn't exactly the same thing as gender. It's kind of a permutation of gender. It's not principally distinct from gender, I would say, but it is a particular manifestation of the principle of gender. If we put the masculine principle as the kind of ground of being, i.e. being in itself, or the real in itself, and we're going to tie this into how human reproduction works, because that's going to be the best way for humans to understand it, of course. Of course, we won't rely on that. And we're going to put the feminine as that which is actually reproducing the masculine, right? So if the dyad is what's reproducing the fundamental principle, the masculine, into the Son, you could say that's also masculine, which would imply that all souls are kind of masculine in a way. And by the way, a lot of kind of ancients refer to the souls as feminine, and I would say, I'm pretty sure, not confirmed, someone can correct me on this, I'm pretty sure the reason they do that is to suggest that they are orbiting God, or the One, or the intelligible realm, like they're orbiting it, because that is the feminine principle. The feminine orbits around the masculine, like empirically, but that's because the feminine is kind of an activation of the masculine. You could say supramasculine, but usually when people put supra in front of a word, you can kind of just reduce it to that word in a way. That word in itself could be masculine in itself, and you wouldn't just reduce masculinity in itself to like human masculinity. That would be the wrong approach, because you'd have to think of human masculinity as a permutation thereof. And yeah, so if the triad, if we're relating that to souls, kind of conditioned in the image of the absolute, or the fundamental, the monad, the triad in the image of the monad, then all souls are, in a sense, beings indeed, would be masculine, and then sex would arise as a kind of conditioning, like kind of a relative conditioning of those souls and how they interact with one another, how they're defined, and how definition also implicates relations. Especially when you have plural souls, all souls are defined. Well, definition essentially becomes synonymous with relation in a lot of ways. So of course you'll have, it's easy to see why souls, though in itself the being is kind of masculine in principle, why sex would arise out of that. Because I know that would probably be a point of contention and confusion, but that's why I would say that is the case. So yeah, let's circle back a little bit. You have the masculine ground of being, its activation or self-involvement, which acts as a womb, the creative principle, because it is the reproductive principle is in a sense the creative principle. And we're also going to relate this to consciousness and subconsciousness in a little bit. But it's that activation. It's not really the directive principle, but it is the creative, and it is subconscious. This is something that kind of works by virtue of the way reality is. There's nothing else for reality to be involved with other than itself. And if you think of human subconsciousness and virtually all animal subconsciousness, it is extremely creative, even in a very literal sense. Like bodies create, heal themselves, whatever, they generate themselves subconsciously just by virtue of the way they are. This is feminine. Even literal reproduction happens. I would argue that somatic intelligence, like bodily intelligence, is a kind of it's not done consciously. You'd probably want to distinct that a little bit from like the conventional understanding of the subconscious mind, but you get the point. It's very creative. Creation, direction happens consciously. Creation, usually not really. A kind of discursive creation does, in a way, for sure. Masculinity, like in man, for instance, in human men, we seed. We plant like seeds, we sow. That is kind of like a directive thing. We do not create, but also like the woman does not create consciously, but her body does subconsciously create. It's like principally creative. Most creative types rely on a lot of intuition, or they, even if they're doing things consciously, a lot of that is kind of like invoking an intuitive state. getting in a flow state where your consciousness is kind of diffused in the subconsciousness to inspire creativity. Inspiration comes a lot of the time subconsciously. So the womb of reality is almost like reality's subconsciousness in a way, and that activation, a lot of people think of the masculine principle as an active principle, and in a way it is, but in a way it's also passive, because consciousness, although it directs and it does things, it never becomes something that it is not. Being never becomes something that it is not. Neither does the subconscious in itself, but you get the point. It turns its attention onto different things, but and that does change. That is active. So I think yin-yang is actually a very good way to see gender, because you do have one and the other, because they're not really principally distinct to begin with. Lacan said something to the effect of woman is a symptom of man, and I don't think he meant it metaphysically. I'm not entirely sure, because I'm not a reader of Lacan, but that is kind of true. Like I said, it's an activation of the masculine principle. But it's not principally distinct therefrom, and you cannot have the masculine be truly masculine without the feminine, because if you have something symptomatic of another thing, then the thing that ultimately the thing that is giving way to its own symptom, its symptom needs to have some place in that thing fundamentally. So femininity and this kind of activation of the principle, although categorically you should distinct the principle in itself from its operation, in a way you should not do that in a very literal way. You should not do that very literally, because you cannot be you can't even be a hyper masculine man without that masculinity containing its due portion of femininity, if that makes sense. If what the masculine principle does is kind of, in a sense, a kind of feminization. Think of this on the grand scale of reality for a second, not in human function, then it's not masculine, it's less masculine without it then, in a way. Then that, because that is what the masculine does. I'm hoping this all makes sense. And it's that kind of presence of the posterior in the prior that, insofar as gender is concerned, I think is relayed pretty well in the yin-yang, particularly the presence of the black in the white and the presence of the white in the black. And it's also one circle, and each of those little dots is also a circle. I don't think that's necessarily explicit in if you look at yin-yang as a diagram, that's supposed to be the point, but nonetheless, the feminine is in the masculine and the masculine is in the feminine. So yes, you have in kind of feminine expressions, like is the case with sex, you have masculinity there, in that being is masculine, and you have femininity in the masculine principle, because feminine is its activation. So relating this to the subject-object distinction, if you look at that as the dyad, and you take dyad to be kind of this engendering process, because subject-object distinction would kind of be thinking, right? If the monad is mind in itself, then subject-object distinction is essentially thinking. It's the mind in itself, then thinking, you have the thinking process, and then the object of thought. That means that the dyad is composed both of the monad and of the object of thought. I would say the object of thought isn't the feminine, rather the process, which would be the dyad as the dyad as such, so to speak, would be the kind of feminine principle, and that would kind of be the polarity, so to speak, and that the object of thought would kind of have both, because it's the object of thought that ultimately renders as the image of the masculine. And when you render an image of the masculine, of course, it will also be engendered with the principle of gender. So something you just have to remember with all principles is when something's principally true, it's true everywhere. It's basically universally true. So, for instance, if the monad naturally becomes the dyad, if the masculine principle naturally gives way to this feminine engendering, self-reproducing process, then so will the triad. So this kind of gets in the principle of correspondence in the Kabbalion. I just call it self-referentiality. And when you have a self-contained system that is one thing, it will be intrinsically self-referential, because there's nothing else beyond that one thing ultimately. So even when you have things that are kind of an illusory nature, like conditions, which gives way to plural souls, and like material objects, or objects in the material sense, which kind of are the objects of thought, the rendering of those objects of thought, so to speak, in image form. These things refer to metaphysics being kind of the nature of nature, because there's nothing else for them to refer to. They have to, in order to exist, in order to be real. Actually, not in order to be real, but by virtue of existing, even in a way that's not principally real in themselves, they have to refer to what is principally real. So too with the principle of gender. You have gender, and you have the monad giving way to the dyad, then the triad, or the kind of the reproduction. Basically what I'm saying is that the reproduction will also have both, so to speak. You could say that the reproduction is in itself masculine, but kind of entails the same gender dynamic that the monad does at its own scale, because I'm going to put forward the stance that souls are essentially kind of individuations of the reality principle at scale, and that scale is essentially the scale at which a soul exists accords to its condition, and either the particularity of that condition or the universality. So a little bit tangential, but I think all of this serves to ultimately expand the understanding of what we're talking about. But yeah, now I'll kind of speak a little bit more casually about gender as far as human gender dynamics are concerned. We definitely all seek to ground our being to some extent. Men generally sometimes do this on other men, which is why that is seen as feminine, because it is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is in a way feminine, and you can't avoid being feminine on all things. So there are probably, as a man, there's probably men that you could stand to orbit in some degree and learn from, etc. I'm not opposed to that. It is feminine in a way. And women in a relationship tend to be happiest. Yeah, look at me talk like that, huh? When they can kind of ground themselves in their man. They seek stability. Generally, there's kind of this cognitive dissonance in the modern woman where they do seek, they seem to think that they want a kind of, they want a partner consciously. They want a partner who will kind of give them a lot of freedom, but in reality, they're kind of just testing them. And I mean freedoms that extend beyond the kind of contract of a relationship, right? Because there are expectations that are implicit in having a relationship. Otherwise, you are contradicting that, which means it just will fail. Consciously, this is the case, but then when this is allowed, it indicates instability in the man, and it indicates that they're not a stable ground of being. They cannot ground their being into their man's, meaning they will probably not continue that relationship. They will slowly become repulsed. Generally, it'll break up organically, and you'll never put two and two together, or maybe they will. But a lot of times it kind of leads to other things being, other problems being created that are more apparent than this one, than this underlying kind of hidden issue, which is the indication of instability in the man. So the man is essentially defined by his being a ground, a foundation, a stable foundation with which the woman can kind of rest herself upon. And if you think like back, even now this is the case. It's kind of a challenged notion now, but even now this is still what makes people happiest. In the past, this was more forthrightly the case. And yeah, the woman generally will orbit kind of the man's provision of a foundation, and she'll kind of oftentimes the roles females will take in relationships is like managerial in a way. They're taking the foundation provided and using it as a basis for the kind of creative impulse. Obviously, they create children, they culture the family, which is extremely important, and men have their place in that as well, but there's a unique place for women with that, I would say. And this stability is almost like a kind of stasis, but honestly, I probably shouldn't even bring those terms up because they might just get too convoluted or misinterpreted. But this kind of stability, or kind of the ground of being, I really just think of the masculine principle as grounding, and the female tries to ground herself therein. And and essentially that creates the family, right? And the children ground themselves in both parents, but in a lot of cases, primarily the father, because he's kind of the foundation of the family. Not that the mother isn't important, but the father is generally the foundation of the family. The children are grounded therein as well. When you remove that ground, you have a lot of problems, as you can see in certain communities that have lower rates of like the father staying at home. This creates a lot of problems. This creates a lot of problems with women who mature without a father. I think a lot of daddy issues, well, obviously it comes from that. And daddy issues is literally an instability through the developmental years, the lack of that ground. When that leads, it doesn't always, but when that leads to promiscuousness, promiscuity, that is essentially the female's being arcing out, seeking a ground, seeking to ground itself desperately. Kind of, it doesn't know how to in a lot of cases because it lacked that ground developing, which in a way kind of means it didn't know how to ground itself. So it's kind of desperately seeking a ground. Oftentimes the males are not interested in actually providing that ground. Sometimes she would stay with it if she could, but she just cannot. But other times she would not, and because she doesn't know how to ground herself in like a male, in a relationship, in the male being, she kind of arcs out, which is indicative of the female's own instability, arcs out seeking grounds, like an electrical arc kind of, but it's not finding a ground. So then you have, promiscuity and casual sex and whatnot. And a lot of men, there's obviously problems with men. Probably the most prevalent is that they don't know how to ground themselves in themselves. They're not grounded in their own being. And that, generally, that kind of like self-groundedness, grounded in your own being, that is like the pinnacle of how to appear masculine, or how to kill. Like, this is what gives way to all of the masculine like attributes, because none of those are masculinity in itself. I think, honestly, one of the best kind of expositions of the attributes of masculinity doesn't really do a good job discerning what it is, but he does do a good job discerning the attributes. Ironically, well, maybe not ironically, but funnily enough, it is Jack Donovan and his book The Way of Men. He does a pretty good job talking about the attributes. Like, I remember one of them is mastery, and there's other attributes we commonly associate with men: being strong, being cool under pressure. All of these things are derived from being like heavily grounded in yourself. And that's something we also lack. That's something that you have a hard time with as a man without a good father figure. And that also creates instability in the man, of course. So yeah, honestly, the dynamics between men and women, using the kind of metaphysical structure we just put forward before, is probably worthy of its own video. But we'll probably close off here talking about one of my favorite examples, which is the solar system. The sun, probably one of the most masculine things we can experience. It is extremely grounded in itself. It pulls in the planets, not actively. Okay, gravity is not like an active force that's actually actively roping things into its orbit. It simply acts by virtue of the magnitude of its being. Like, by virtue of the magnitude of its being, the other bodies are put into its orbit, not actively. Like, gravity is not something that's actively being done. It's such an immense being that by virtue of that immensity, these other bodies are pulled into its orbit. It doesn't have to actively do that, it just is. And that's the same thing with masculinity in human men. And of course, actually, the most masculine thing you can experience is God, because you have no choice but to orbit the reality principle. But in kind of more empirical experience, I suppose, the sun is very, very masculine. You could even say, like, all of the planets and bodies orbiting around the sun are like the sun's multiple wives. A planet and its moons, the moons are put into orbit by the immensity of the planet's being. Some planets have multiple moons. Not necessarily using this as an argument for polygamy, but there's probably a place where that would make sense. not necessarily going to make the argument that in the human permutation of gender, that is the optimal way, save for maybe theoretically in very select cases. However, you know, the sun is a very, very masculine thing, and the planets orbit around the sun. They're drawn in by its immense presence, its being, and they receive its radiance. I was gonna get into why gender is ultimately the only polarity. If you've read the Kybalion, you know the principle of polarity in the Kybalion is basically a principle of relativity. That's what it should be named, because it's not a true polarity in the sense of like a magnet, for instance. Like if you have masculine and feminine as polarizations of the same thing, what is the substrate? I would say it's masculine. It's the masculine principle. But if you're gonna put it like that, you probably would need something else, and you can't really say it's gender, because if gender is like a process, it'd have to be something else. But in the sense of polarity in the Kybalion, he kind of just describes relativity, like temperature, for instance. A big point against that is hot and cold. It's kind of like one is the lack of the other, or a lesser degree of the other. Of course, that is predicated of in the description. That's a difference of degree. The same thing in principle, but then it's not really a polarity. It's relativity. Like you can't have a polarity between a lack of something or privation of something and the thing, because that's not an actual thing, right? It's not an actual. A privation isn't a thing. Negation isn't predication, in the words of Damascus, I think. But I probably won't go too much into that. But I do think that masculine and feminine is ultimately the true polarity, as in polarizing impulse. Almost like it, by virtue, and the reason that you actually have the masculine, even though masculine is also the substrate, is because it's a self-involving impulse. I could see and understand confusion there, but I think that probably would be a good topic for another day, commenting on other things in the Kybalion. Not that a principle of relativity would be a bad thing, but I do think it's not essentially a really apt thing to call that polarity. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. I do appreciate it, because this will be probably a pretty long one by the time I'm done. But good on you for getting through it, and I will see you in the next video.